Yes. Okay. Okay. Um, I think we could start. Good afternoon and a warm welcome to our panel discussion, Arrival Infrastructures of the Displaced from Ukraine in Vienna. I'm Ayşe Çağlar. I'm a permanent fellow at IWM. Since Tuesday, IWM has been home to several talks, very vivid discussions and exhibitions on Ukraine within the frame of the impressing Documenting Ukraine program anchored at IWM. Today in our panel discussion, we will be moving to another important topic directly resulting from the war in Ukraine, namely the dynamics, processes, and the challenges of the reception or quote-unquote arrival of the displaced from Ukraine in Vienna, unleashed by the invasion of Ukraine 24th February 2022. The starting point of our panel is the findings of our research project on the arrival infrastructures of the displaced from Ukraine in Vienna, the same title of the panel discussions, which we have immediately embarked on last year after the invasion and conducted within the frame of Europe-Asia Research Platform on forced migration, which I'm directing at IWM. There is not at the Asia part of it, but I think a project on forced migration could not have not embarked on the displacement of the Ukrainians, displacement of the people from Ukraine in Europe. Before I introduce our research team, who will present our findings briefly, I would first like to introduce our panel members. WWII Himmler is currently the head of the Department of Asylum and Integration at Caritas and has worked in this field for years. I think the central role of Caritas in the reception of the displaced in Vienna is beyond any debate, so we are very happy to have him at our panel. Nina Andresen is the coordinator at the Train of Hope, which she joined in 2015 when this organization emerged from the grassroots initiative of helping arriving refugees at that time. In 2022, the Train of Hope was running the humanitarian arrival center for the displaced people from Ukraine. I am sure you're familiar with the Train of Hope too and what they had achieved. Next to Nina Andresen is Nataliia Kolchanova, who came to Vienna from Kiev in spring 2022. She is a psychologist by profession and training and is working as a psychologist, but she wanted to be part of the panel primarily as someone displaced from Ukraine in Vienna and wanted to share her experiences in that regard. But of course, she has the double role in Vienna, I think. And Tanja Maier is an independent volunteer. She became involved in helping the arriving displaced people from Ukraine from the first days on after the outbreak of the full-scale war. And I think for the people who are interested and working on the topic of the displaced people from Ukraine, she's a very well-known name and person. She has launched the charity initiative Cards for Ukraine that distributes prepaid grocery cards to the displaced people in need. Now I have to make an update in relation to our participants list. Unfortunately, Saskia Schwaiger will not be able to participate as announced. She is sick, like many others in the city, in Vienna right now, and this is very unfortunate, as we definitely wanted to have this discussion with the participation, the perspective, and the voice of the city of Vienna. She was going to represent city of Vienna. I think we all know how much the city of Vienna had shouldered in the reception of the displaced from Ukraine, and we were particularly keen on having Saskia Schwaiger in this panel, among other things, because she served as the media spokesperson from the crisis management city of Vienna from the very beginning of the war, and so she had very valuable experience about the challenges and the changing challenges of the governance and the management of the influx of the displaced people they posed to the city of Vienna. Nevertheless, we are grateful that the city of Vienna had sent us now a short statement about their position, which I will present right after the brief presentation of the findings of our research. Now, please allow me to introduce our research team. Our research team is composed of Volha Bizyukova, who is a social and maybe you can stand, who is a social and political anthropologist who has received her PhD at the University of Vienna, and she was also an IWM visiting fellow with the Institute's program from September 2019 and May 2020, and she's right now a postdoc at Central European University, CEU. Then we have Ruslana Kuzienko, who is also a social anthropologist and a PhD candidate at CEU, and she was also an IWM fellow with the Institute's program for scholars from Ukraine in summer 2022. And we have Anna Lazareva. She's completing her MA in the political science at the University of Vienna, and she's originally from Ukraine and received her BA in political science and economics from the Goethe University in Frankfurt. Now, I would like to give the floor to Olga and Ruslana to present briefly the main findings of the research conducted in Vienna. And after we hear the research findings, I will ask each panel member to react, reflect, and or challenge these findings very briefly with very short statements. Then we will discuss the we will discuss the arrival infrastructures, their bottlenecks, and the challenges for the displaced from Ukraine in Vienna. Both challenges to the displaced, but also to the city. So let me give the floor to Olga and Ruslana for the findings, please. I'll come there.
Hello, is it working? Okay. Thank you, Ayşe, for this very kind introduction of our research team. And good evening, everyone. And tonight we would like to present to you some of the key findings of our research, arrival infrastructures, processes of emplacement of displaced people from Ukraine in Vienna. The project was launched by the Institute for Human Sciences, and our analysis relies on fieldwork which we conducted in summer-autumn 2022, and which included more than 35 in-depth interviews with displaced persons from Ukraine and people involved in managing the influx as part of different organizations and initiatives. We supplemented the data from the interviews with participant observation, relevant policy documents, statements, and media materials. In this talk, we would like to speak first about the response to the influx of people at the European level and the introduction of temporary protection and dilemmas associated with it. Then we will address the way the temporary protection regime was implemented in Austria, in particular in connection to the system of Grundversorgung and the consequences of this decision. After that, we will touch upon the unprecedented reliance on civil society in the reception of people from Ukraine, its pros and cons. And afterwards, we will discuss the coping strategies that displaced people develop in the situation shaped by these larger institutional and governing structures. The scale of Russia's war on Ukraine and the mass displacement is usually presented as extraordinary. However, the reception of displaced people from Ukraine in Vienna and across the European countries has been shaped by the historically established approaches to dealing with forced migration and migration in general. Thus, while there are important particularities, such as the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive, the situation of displaced people from Ukraine needs to be seen vis-à-vis the existing system, legacies, and experiences of other displaced groups in Austria. In fact, there is a pattern of approaching mass influxes in Europe as extraordinary, thus improbable. And this, in turn, impacts the management of the current situation and tends to obscure tendencies that produce it. The very status of temporary protection is not a recent invention. The corresponding EU-wide directive was introduced in 2001 in the aftermath of the war in former Yugoslav countries. While listing basic guarantees and rights, the directive does not specify the level of provisioning or the mechanism of implementation by the EU states. And as a result, when first activated in early March 2022, European countries had to decide how to put it in practice in their national legal context and how to provide access to the labor market, basic social services, accommodation, and other spheres. The status offered by temporary protection is different from asylum seeker or a refugee and is not embedded in the system regulating international protection at the national level. While all the states were confronted with the same dilemmas, there was a range of possible solutions, and individual countries chose different paths. The path taken by Austria in many ways was shaped by the institutional and legislative approaches to forced and labor migration in this country, as well as the specificity of the federal government system. The status of displaced person in Austria did not contain a pathway for transitioning to other statuses of international protection or other long-term resident statuses in Austria. The decisive factor of temporary protection in Austria was the decision to include displaced people from Ukraine in the system of Grundversorgung. Grundversorgung is a system that was introduced in the early 2000s for basic provisioning for asylum seekers during the period of their asylum application. And Grundversorgung entitles one to cash allowance up to 260 euros per month for an adult, and accommodation assistance up to 330 euros per family or are placed in an organized facility. In the later case, when people are also fed, the cash payment is reduced to the absolute minimum of 40 euros per month. It is generally acknowledged that the logic behind this low level of assistance within Grundversorgung was to disincentivize potential asylum applications in Austria. The inclusion of the displaced from Ukraine in Grundversorgung resulted in several important contradictions. First, while Grundversorgung is devised for temporary provisioning during the asylum application, for the displaced from Ukraine, it is a fixed situation, as there is no transition path to the general social security system, to which, for instance, recognized refugees are entitled. Second, Grundversorgung system hindered access to the labor market. As of now, the provision is kept conditional on the absence of sufficient means of subsistence, with a threshold of monthly earnings at 110 euros and 80 euros for each dependent. If you earn more, you lose Grundversorgung. This works against the promise of temporary protection to provide access to the labor market. But currently, there are anticipated changes which should introduce a gradual reduction of social assistance proportionally to income. Still, the legislation and the mechanisms are yet to be officially accepted and publicized. And third, Grundversorgung is geared to provisioning within organized facilities, where asylum seekers are usually accommodated and often fed. But in Vienna, around 90% of displaced people from Ukraine are housed privately, either for free and for some payment. And all in all, the Grundversorgung system leaves the displaced with inadequate means to support themselves, especially living in private, while also hindering their access to the labor market. Arguably, in the long run, people under temporary protection appear, in many respects, to end up in a disadvantageous position compared to the refugees and people under subsidiary protection. Furthermore, attempts to change anything in the Grundversorgung system ran into a legislative and political stalemate between the federal state and federal lands. A different arrival trajectory of displaced people from Ukraine also contributed to the specificity of the situation. In Austria, the federal state is responsible for receiving newly arriving asylum seekers, usually at the state border, as it happened in 2015. In 2022, the situation was different. Ukrainian citizens in general enjoy a visa-free regime with the European Union. Furthermore, after the outbreak of the full-scale war, the borders were fully opened. Thus, people traveled through the country, arriving directly in the city of Vienna by trains, buses, and private cars. This put a disproportionate burden and responsibility on the city of Vienna. The city had to find solutions and resources for assisting the majority transitioning to other countries and also those who remain in Austria. Still, the number of those who stayed in Austria, both in relative and absolute terms, is within the average in the European Union. And furthermore, it is significantly smaller than in the neighboring countries, in particular Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia.
Thank you, Olga. I will continue with discussing the outstanding reliance on civil society in the reception of people from Ukraine. So the response to the influx of people was shaped by an extraordinary reliance on civil society. This includes NGOs, independent volunteers, and broader civil society which donated humanitarian aid, money, and offered private accommodation. This situation in general is along the lines of the broader global tendencies in providing social services, namely NGOization, that is reliance on non-state agents, and voluntarization, that is drawing on non-paid labor and donations. Overall, the civil society in Vienna forms a heterogeneous landscape of actors who have different resources, forms of cooperation with the state, and organization of work. In this context, the long-established system of cooperation between the city of Vienna and large NGOs that act on behalf of the city has also marked the management of the current influx. The response in the first days after the outbreak of the war was largely shouldered by independent volunteers and grassroots initiatives. They were meeting the first waves of people arriving at the Hauptbahnhof. Later, ÖBB, Austrian Railways, delegated this task to Caritas, which also actively relied on the help of volunteers. Train of Hope, an initiative that fully operates on a voluntary basis, had been running the humanitarian arrival center in the 2nd district for 10 months. While the facilities, utilities, and COVID testing were provided by the city, the center relied on donations to meet other needs of the arriving displaced people. Those involved in the first response shared the feeling of a general lack of preparedness and coordination and the impression that the state learned little from the influx of people in 2015. Still, the grassroots organizations appeared to be able to react faster than established NGOs. This was often explained by overregulation and restricted power in decision-making, which resulted in less flexibility and less proactiveness. Still, large NGOs played a central role in allocating and organizing assistance, including that which was channeled by the state. For example, Caritas has been providing Grundversorgung to those accommodated privately, and Diakonie coordinated the distribution of privately offered accommodation. And all major NGOs were engaged in running short and long-term accommodation facilities of different scales, though the conditions in different places varied. Thus, the response to the influx of displaced people has been developing a kind of a patchwork of ad hoc tactics in order to address immediate problems, often with a relatively short horizon of planning. However, these ad hoc tactics were still shaped by the existing path-binding structures and the constellation of major actors. One of the consequent bottlenecks was the basic failure of the second line of reception, that is, providing for the basic needs beyond the immediate arrival. Over time, the volume of resources available through donations dwindled, while such a form of support as the free public transport provided by the city was also withdrawn. In these conditions, displaced people had to develop a patchwork of coping strategies to sustain themselves in Austria in the long term. Due to the insufficient level of assistance to cover the basic needs, one had to secure additional sources of support. This means seeking diverse forms of income in Austria or from elsewhere, remittances from relatives or friends, savings, accommodation provided for free or at a lower than the market price, various humanitarian aid, and the like. Sustaining this fragile balance of resources resulted in a range of vulnerabilities. For example, the highly unpredictable and unstable situation with private accommodation, or the need to declare that people do not have any valuables or savings so that the modest social assistance they receive is not reduced. For instance, the pension received in Ukraine, such as around 50 euros, can be deducted from the payment as well. The majority of our interlocutors spoke about their willingness to find employment as soon as possible, but most of them were unable to do so, as is also confirmed by the available statistics. They encounter the barriers common to all European countries, such as language, recognition of diplomas, and work experience, but there are also hindrances specific to Austria, for instance, the aforementioned low Grundversorgung threshold for earnings and the IMS work permit. The latter is promised to be finally lifted in April 2023. In this situation, people were unable to either to find full-time qualified positions or official part-time jobs with less qualification. This pushed some people into the informal labor market. When it comes to education, the city of Vienna provided children of all ages with places at schools. Nevertheless, mothers were still struggling to ensure the quality of education and social inclusion of their children in the situation of uncertainty about the duration of their stay in Austria. Some continued a parallel online education in Ukraine. While the situation in healthcare is probably the most benign, the language barrier and the differences in the medical practice in Austria and Ukraine still pose a challenge to many, especially affecting such vulnerable groups of people people with disabilities and serious conditions. Unfortunately, despite the efforts and the engagement of various state and non-state actors, the strain and contradictions of the system we described had to be borne by the people from Ukraine themselves. Notwithstanding all the difficulties, our interlocutors refused to succumb to despair and the position of helplessness. On the other hand, it is important to note that even though there are no available statistics, many people were pushed to take the decision of leaving Austria, thus often preferring the safety of Ukraine. Overall, even though the reception of people fleeing the war in Ukraine was indeed marked by unprecedented expression of solidarity, their situation in Vienna continues to be characterized by many struggles, shortages, and vulnerabilities. Furthermore, the over-reliance on civil society results in a number of bottlenecks, and in the long run, it does not seem to be sustainable unless systematic state support is put in place. And rather than representing an exception, the situation of Ukrainians exposed to the existing tensions and dynamics of the system that govern the reception of the displaced people in Austria in general. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for these are the findings in a nutshell, and then you just heard actually the friction points and then the basic dilemmas and the contradictions that of the arrival infrastructures for the displaced from Ukraine in Vienna. Before I give the floor to our panelists, I would read part of the statement of the city of Vienna, because I think it is very important to have their voice. After the outbreak of the war, the city of Vienna, I'm reading it from their statement, the city of Vienna reacted quickly. The city's crisis management team was set up immediately. Responsibilities are clearly distributed within the city. Each department and agency knows their tasks and duties. The good cooperation between the city, NGOs, Blaulicht organizations and civil society made it possible to take concrete measures quickly. Thanks to the great support of the Viennese, it was possible for many Ukrainians to find housing. Train of Hope has done a great job. That's what the city of Vienna refers to. They give an overview of the important measures. I'm not going to read all the measures, but they just single out a couple of them. The city of Vienna has responded quickly to set up a number of drop-in centers. The sports and fun halle was turned into a humanitarian reception center for newly arriving Ukrainians. The hall was provided by the city of Vienna. Train of Hope has taken over the organization of the support activities, and together with volunteers has done a tremendous job. And there were more than 5,000 places in emergency shelters were provided as emergency accommodation, and there were some advisory centers for people from Ukraine. And for example, the Austria Center Vienna, Ukrainians can apply for the Grundversorgung there. So you have the idea that how central it was to have that the Grundversorgung, and what kind of a maze it was also opening, kind of the maze it was opening. And there was also, in beginning of April, actually these were very quick, and a registration system was offered online. Ukrainians could register online for an appointment. The long waits in front of Austria Center Vienna quickly came to an end. And in the first few months, people were also supported in finding privately donated accommodation. The city of Vienna, as we have heard, has taken diacony with collecting and allocating accommodation donations centrally. So, and over 23,000 people have applied for Grundversorgung. This doesn't mean that they got it, but they had applied for Grundversorgung. And to have, for long-term infrastructures, the city of Vienna has what they had done is the number of places in Grundversorgung were significantly increased. The current status is 6,000 places available in Grundversorgung, which is 3,400 more than February 22. And there were also advisory centers for Ukrainians were established, because there were some several counseling centers for asylum seekers available in Vienna, but city needed additional ones because with the temporary protection system, you have access to the labor market theoretically and legally. So the counseling had to be different. And in terms of the Grundversorgung, that the statement, I'm just reading it, quoting it, it is an undisputed fact that the financial support under the Grundversorgung scheme is insufficient, especially for women and children. Finding accommodation for this amount of money is a great challenge. The federal government, the Ministry of the Interior and the Ministry of Finance is called upon to redress this situation. So you see the kind of the frictions there. It was the federal government that decided to take displaced persons into Grundversorgung. Alternatively, they could have been taken into the social welfare benefit scheme, which some other countries did. So this was this is the statement that the city of Vienna, unfortunately not present here, and gave it. Don't knock down this water. So let me move to the podium and then give the floor to our panel members to make kind of very short statements in relation to the findings. As I said, it could be reflecting, expanding, challenging, criticizing, however you wish. That we are here to discuss. Okay, I will start in this order, so it is the easiest for me. So. Please, David Preukschat Himmler.
David's fine, it's difficult
That's
enough.
okay. I get confused with the order of the family name.
It's a silly business. A lot of points, and yeah, hard to remember, but just maybe two things to highlight. Not much to challenge, but two things to highlight, which I thought you referred to specifically and were worth highlighting. Most, if not all, of the challenges that you were describing that Ukrainian displaced people were facing in the very first days of arriving and are now facing almost a year thereafter are, I would argue, basic challenges sort of baked into a very flawed compromise at the root of what you've referred to as Grundversorgung, which is a piece of vocabulary we're all going to have to deal with. There's a very flawed compromise there. You alluded to this, sort of not incentivizing too much, and not too welcoming system of reception. And I think on the one hand, what Ukrainians felt and are feeling right now is a sort of a basic lack of services in many different ways, of access to the labor market, which in theory they have, but as being part of Grundversorgung they don't in a way. So there's a lot of baked-in challenges in that system, which I also have to point out affects every other asylum seeker who's ever been part of the Grundversorgung system. And then on top of that, you have the new legal instrument of temporary protection, which didn't help at all of smoothing out these challenges, but just added another layer of complexity onto a system which was already not only unpronounceable, but also hard to manage, hard to navigate, and unsustainable in many ways. So I think what your research has shown in a very concise way was not only were there problems to begin with, but the way that the Austrian government, and I would include, because in the system of Grundversorgung there's 10 actors, there's 9 federal states and the federal government. So I wouldn't so much pass the blame just onto the federal government. It's a very, it's a sort of funky construction that we don't have in many other legislative areas where there's actually 10 partners, all with a veto in all of these different substructures of Grundversorgung. So I think that's sort of the most important point to me, is that a lot of these flaws were already there to begin with, or were even intensified by just a basic legal decision that was made, which brought with it a whole host of problems, and which will bring with it, and I think this is also something we might focus on in the discussion, a host of problems when it comes to deciding and what will happen to the legal status of Ukrainians in another year's time, when this first renewal of the temporary protection directive runs out. And there are apparently discussions about how to sort of transition into a system of social care. But social care is not a legal status. Social care is a system of, providing benefits. What we actually do need is a system of legal status for Ukrainians that provides them with a sort of stability that the temporary protection directive, being temporary, so it's in the name, it was never designed to. So that's another challenge that we might.
Okay, thank you very much, David. I will give the floor to Nina Andresen. So whatever you would like to pick up from the findings and expand or reflect or open up.
I wanted to pick up on the Grundversorgung system, but David said it all, so I'm going to use another topic now. So what you mentioned was, on the one side, relying on civil society and also depending on Viennese citizens, Austrians, to care for or cover basic needs, and on the other hand, the absence of a secondary reception system. And that is something that I wouldn't talk about only focusing on the month that lie behind us, but also facing the future, because the secondary reception is still not in place. When we talk about Grundversorgung, we talk about having a roof above your head, having something to eat, which is not enough at all, having no access to public transport. So there are still so many needs that are not covered, and where we can't see any more efforts than calling upon a ministry to change something, but where we don't really see how Austria and also the different regions in Austria is coming up with proposals on what the single regions could do, how they could increase the provision of help for the people, how they could make a positive impact on the lives of people. I remember we had the same in 2015, 2016, the same criticism, Grundversorgung is not enough, we need to integrate people, we need additional services. So there were a lot of programs that were invented and then they were closed again. So now we're standing more or less at the same point where we see, okay, the system that hasn't been working for years and years now still isn't working. We still know that there's the struggle between the 10 actors that never agree on anything positive. So there's always at least one region that says no. So it could also be the other way around. It could also be the approach of the region saying, well, but they are living in my region. They are living in my city. It's my citizens. They will stay longer or not. We don't know for how long. But for the time being, it's people living in my city, so what do I offer those people to create a livable life for all the people in my city? So that is something I think that needs to be addressed for the future, the secondary reception, the role also of the regions and the cities in the provision of help and support. And of course, having said this, we are still heavily relying on civil society, and we are still relying on a solidarity that has been more or less killed a bit by the official sites because it was over-relying on solidarity. So the civil society, people that took in Ukrainians, they felt they owned themselves. They took people in and now there they are with all the problems, with all the uncovered needs. So I think solidarity is really important, but you need to use solidarity in a more intelligent way to keep the level of solidarity up and provide help and support for the people in the upcoming month.
Okay, thank you very much, Nina. I think it is the secondary reception system is the very, very important part of it. And also that I think we hear you very much about the more initiatives or more voice and initiatives from the cities and then the regions, but also very important point, not to overburden the solidarity of the people, not withdrawing actually from certain kinds of responsibilities and then the accountabilities. Thank you very much. I will give the floor to Nataliia now, and just would like to hear your reaction to the...
Explain my experience, yes. And you know, due to war, my life changed extremely. Yes, and I have a lot of questions. At one time, I need to solve a lot of questions, yes. And maybe social support was very important to me first 6 months, yes, because I didn't know what I need to do. I never have been in Vienna, yes, and new city for me, and a lot of new points. Yes, and for me, very important was social support, transport, cultural pass, and another small nuances which provided Vienna. And also my family helped me, and also friends, yes. And I realized that in such a situation, very important to, like society, like group with when I can talk about myself, yes, about my problem, about my life. And also I had some problems with find at my work, yes, because I'm a psychologist, and for working I need some permission. Yes, I need notification, and it's very difficult because for notification I need have German B2, yes. And I also sent to Caritas my CV, and Caritas tell me, oh, I'm sorry, you don't have yes. Yes, and my way was quite hard, yes, because, you know, I felt maybe big stress because I realized that without work I can't be in Vienna, yes. And I wrote some motivation letter, yes, and with time NEDA Ukraine, it's project, and Deborah, it's my manager, invited me to this work with Ukrainian refugees. Yes, and for me it was, I was happy, really. Yes, because it's my dream to work by profession, yes, and use my qualification. And I also had some problem with even recognizing my diploma. Yes, because it's also a long way. It's one nuances, yes. You know, for us and for my friends, very important to work. Yes, and for example, one of my acquaintances built some battery, yes, and she also find work here, and she is also have good experience. But it's very difficult, yes, with so strong rules, yes. You know, I realized that our education is really good. Yes, only here I realized that we have good experience, yes, and we also have good teachers. And if we talk about school, yes, it's also some problem because my daughter, she really want to study, and only now we look for new possibility, go from simple school to lyceum, government lyceum, yes, and it's also a big task. And if we talk about accommodation, oh, it's very, very difficult task, yes, because, for example, I have only 20 hours, working hours. It's not a lot of money, and I need to find accommodation, yes, and I need to pay rent, and it's a big challenge to me. And even now, I have a finished contract. I maybe point out that we have a lot of tasks, and it's very big pressure to us. Yes, work, child, yes, and my husband now in Ukraine, and he helps military. He worked in a special fund which help Ukrainians. And your support, yes, very essential for us, really, yes, because, for example, I work also with Ukrainians, and all Ukrainians a lot of Ukrainians want come back to Ukraine. And even me, it's my dream to live in Kyiv. But at the same time, I realized that the situation in Ukraine very dangerous. Yes, and we don't know what will be next in the future, yes. I can tell a lot, but with some limit.
Our time is limited, but these are very valuable experiences. But also that what you point out, the problems with the nostrifications, recognitions, and what it does. Displacement, this is in general, that is what displacement does to the skills. Yes. And it is not only any kind of for income, but the work is so pivotal in terms of the way that we define ourselves and the way we relate to the others. And once that ground is taken or is shaken, it becomes the ground for various other problems. Yes. And what you're also referring to as the daily support network structures, which are very important, but there are certain issues which could not be solved only by those kind of networks and support structures, starting with that you have to have language competency, to have your diplomas to be recognized so that you could practice your profession. I would like to give the floor to Tanja Maier now for picking up certain points from our findings. Then we will discuss. I have some other kind of questions, actually, specific questions to all the panel members, whoever would like to pick that up. But
first, I'd like to thank you for your research, because I think for most of us, most of 2022 was like a blur, and we didn't have time. Those of us who were living in the moment didn't have time to reflect. And I was really fascinated when you sent me the summary bullet points, because there are a lot of the talking points that I've been talking with the media and trying to write about this year, but I've never seen them so succinctly in one place, put so diplomatically, which I'm not always the best at. So I think it's a really important also to document this time. And I think one of the things that was touched upon was this is not the first crisis and it's not the last, so there should be something of a system for crisis response. And I guess I should just say that, like, I have a different perspective because I'm not coming from a social work or humanitarian aid background. I am simply a person who was living in Vienna who happened to have Russian language skills. And I got a message on Twitter early March of last year that, hey, you should go to the train station because they need people to help who speak Russian or Ukrainian. And so that's how I literally fell into all of this. And it took over my life last year, and it's still taken over my life. And it wasn't anything that I intended to happen, just like, well, it's not comparable to what the Ukrainians have been through, but in the sense that, so that's the background. And then what I've learned this year, because what happened was, a whole lot of Ukrainians got my phone number. That's basically the short story. And we worked together at the train station. I have many familiar faces in the audience. And then I was also a volunteer with a budget, which was a little bit different than your average volunteer, because I was writing about what I was hearing, what we were experiencing. There were a whole lot of emotions and stories that were coming out as people were getting off of those trains, and I was trying to share some of them so that the world would know what was happening. And then people were writing me and saying, hey, instead of you buying all those coffees, let us help you buy those coffees or pay for that hotel room or tickets onwards or whatever it was. So that's the context. And then we started distributing supermarket gift cards in April, because what happens was Ukrainians who had already arrived in Austria were coming to the train station, and Caritas had set up a great cafeteria there. But then they were being told you can't eat because you're not traveling onwards. You live here. This cafeteria is not for you. So then I was like, what? Like, there's a person sitting in front of you that's hungry and their money has run out, and we're having to say no. So we realized that there was a need here. So people came. They spent their savings that they brought with them could have been not a lot of money at all. And then they were waiting a long time to get that first payment, which I didn't know what Grundversorgung was. I didn't know what any of this was. I mean, I was like, I, like other people, brought food and clothes in 2015, but I wasn't on the inside of any of it. So I've unfortunately learned more than I would have ever liked to know about Austrian politics and bureaucracy and everything else, and I'm thinking a lot about Kafka this year. But so I think it's really important that we take a moment to have a discussion like this, because it's interesting. The EU has, I don't know how many countries, and all of them have sort of responded a little bit differently. So we'd have these discussions at the train station. A Ukrainian family would call to you and say, where should we go, where should we go? And I always said, don't stay. I said that openly. I said, keep going. And we talk about, okay, Belgium's paying more money. We had these conversations together at the train station, and we'd say, okay, Belgium will give you more money, but you got to know someone, you have to have a place to live. And then Denmark will let you come, and Denmark might be good, but you can't stop anywhere on your way there, or they won't let you in. And to this day, those conversations continue. So I think we've touched a lot on a lot of the major issues. When the journalists first started contacting me in the spring, I kept saying money, money, money. And the other thing is Ukrainians are like super digital. Every person, even the 75-year-old grandma sitting in front of you, has some kind of a smartphone with a cracked screen, and she knows how to do whatever you tell her to do on the internet, right? So I couldn't understand, why don't they just build a website, take everybody's data, Erste Bank was opening bank accounts in a matter of 5 minutes. But we did this sort of Austrian thing with papers, and go here and then go there and get that stamped, and then no, that's the wrong stamp, and then you go back again, and then you don't get paid for 3 or 4 months. And there are so many chefs in the kitchen, right, which we've touched upon. The federal government, 9 different, I had no idea that every single state parliament has to ratify whatever little change needs to happen. And then you have several different NGOs, and in every Bundesland it's a different NGO that's doing X, Y, and Z. And what I think a lot of these problems, the root cause is money wasn't put on the table and legislation didn't happen. Because if the government at the federal level had gotten together and passed a law and said, okay, we're not going to put Ukrainians in Grundversorgung, we're going to do something different with them, then maybe this whole year would have looked differently. And there were some good things, like the Familienbeihilfe was a real help for people with kids. This Klimabonus, they're all obsessed with how we can get the Klimabonus, and I'm like, you don't do anything, you just have to wait, and that drives them crazy. What do you mean? Oh my God, it came from me and not the kids, but they said the kids don't exist, and then there's messages, so it's just...
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That is, I mean, of course, it is a kind of, the bureaucracy is the maze, but I mean, on the other hand, I think I'm glad that you touched upon also the Familienbeihilfe and the education system, that the way that the displaced people from Ukraine, that the displaced, their children were put into every level of education that was facilitated. Of course, it has its own challenges, and I mean, everyone seems to be agreeing on the problems of that, the Grundversorgung, which might have been dealt differently, but also I have the fortune or the unfortunate to know where that the temporary protection system, how it works in other geographies and in relation to some other groups, that so it is putting it into a comparative perspective is very, very useful, I think, to when we are talking about the discontents of the benefits and then the discontents of the temporary protection system. But I would like to come, I know that David could not talk in the name of the city of Vienna, but as a major NGO that the city had collaborated with, I would like to hear from you, and then maybe Nina from you, that what were the basic challenges this time that the city of Vienna was confronted with, or as Caritas as an NGO, because both Train of Hope and Caritas, you were very much involved. Actually, Train of Hope came up with the 2015, quote unquote, the crisis. So what were the different challenges in this time for the NGOs or for the city of Vienna to see in a kind of the comparatively, or what was learned from there and transferred, but maybe not, or taken everything. I mean, it came up from the conversations that it was identified as a kind of the crisis and extraordinary, the exceptional. And this is what we know, those kind of designations are not simple designations. They do certain things. They have performative impact in terms of the way certain policies are put in place and implemented. So 2015 was a kind of a crisis, and this one is a kind of exceptional, very different kind, maybe in the way that was put. So I would like to hear from you what you think that this time, what the major challenge was for the city. Was it different or not? Or also as Caritas. I mean, I don't want to force you to, because from City of Vienna they said that, oh, Caritas could talk for us too. I said that would be very unfair. I said that would be very unfair. I'm not going to do that. So, but because you have collaborated very much, maybe you could tell us about those challenges and what, for example, Train of Hope, which came into existence, what was it different in this case? So, please.
Well, I think you make a good point that sort of designating something as extraordinary does something, as you put it. I think what it does is it sort of it severs a connection between a system that was already in place and the extraordinary situation. So I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think one of the major challenges then and now was, as you pointed out, starting from scratch. So what had grown between 2015 and, say, 2018, 19 maybe, had sort of all been sort of slowly reduced and sort of defunded here and there, or just simply closed down. Accommodation sites were closed, integration projects were closed, language classes were closed, and all of that because if you're sort of feeling very generous in your view, because the need wasn't there anymore. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but if you were feeling generous, then okay, the need has changed, let's put it like that. And I think that's sort of one of the main challenges in working in sort of the refugee sector in Austria, is that as NGOs, as sort of associations, we all tend to mirror the need of stability that our clients have. As in, we can run a lot of programs, we can run counseling sites, we can do all of these things, but in the end, and you pointed this out, it comes down to money at a certain stage. So there is a question that even a major NGO like Caritas that does have some of its own funding has to ask itself, where am I going to sort of invest my limited resources? Like a decision that Caritas made 20 odd years ago was to heavily invest into legal counseling, which is something we've done for 20 odd years at the sort of standard level of service. But that means that certain things, once they are not funded anymore, we can't do. So when the city of Vienna approaches us and says, hey, basically you've done this before, you got to find the people who did this before and hope that they haven't left you because they still had a job in your organization. So it comes down to sort of banalities. Where do we put experienced people? Where do we put the people who know how to get an accommodation site running within, say, 24 hours? Where do we find people who know the Grundversorgung system with all its sort of challenges inside out, so they can adapt to a new legal framework that nobody has had any experience with? And how do we put all of these people together in what was basically at Austria Center an empty former vaccination site? And then to tell people like, yeah, you go on. And unfortunately we have these people, and you guys have these people, and then there's volunteers like yourself who are sort of taking up the challenge. And all of that goes to show that, again, if you're feeling generous, there's a lot of energy there that you can sort of use to get things going. And then you end up at a spot where it's time to sort of consolidate, to get to a point where you're like, all right, we've learned this, and these are sort of the structures that we're going to implement for the time being. And this is something that Grundversorgung just wasn't designed to do. It was designed to provide for people for the time being, for sort of status determination, and then that was that. And if that bed wasn't needed and it wasn't funded, you put it away. So that is maybe the one thing that wasn't learned between 2015 and 2016, and which might have even gotten worse, depending on how you look at it, is the system, both on the federal and on the states level, it doesn't really have any sort of buffer capacities where you have, and this is basic stuff, but you basically need 4 walls, a roof, and a lot of beds in the very first, sort of in the beginning. And the Blaulicht organizations you mentioned, they are very good at putting beds together very quickly, but this is something that's sort of this is something that the system isn't designed to do, in a sense. So you're starting from scratch again, and all the colleagues of mine who've been with Caritas like 3, 4, 5 crises past, they get a sort of jadedness about them, like, here we go again, which, I mean, is healthy in a sort of professional setting, but not in a really structural one.
Okay, thank you very much, because I think it's very important also to underline that this is not the temporary protection status, but temporariness of, it is kind of a contradictory, but the infrastructures, kind of the put, there is that kind of a temporariness in that, which is actually contradictory to the concept of the infrastructure, but the structures were there, and then they were, because it is extraordinary, because it is a crisis, and it is temporary seen, no matter whether you are under protection, temporary protection system, or as a refugee or asylum seeker, not the refugee, but there will be a normality, there would be something else there. But so I think in terms of temporariness of the structures and the provision of the services and the care is, I think, very important, and they were dismantled. That is, they were quite quickly dismantled.
If I just might a tiny little point, and the one thing between sort of the temporariness of protection and then that sort of other status that happens afterwards, that's not a binary transition. That's not something that just sort of happens like, all right, now everything's sorted. And you pointed this out, like there's a lot of like there's housing, there's taking care of education and schools, and these are all things that happen at the click of a button. Like here's another status, and we've experienced this with asylum seekers for years and years and years, where people are waiting for the end of status determination for years and years on end, and then somebody flips a bureaucratic switch, and then here's you know, here's a recognized refugee status, and then all of these challenges happen all at once. And so there's not, what that system also doesn't have is a very good way of transitioning, and that's sort of what you were referring to with sort of the second line. This is what we need now, the way of transitioning.
And then the transition is actually from the findings. It is very important. This temporary protection status does not allow you transition, so that you can't change your status. That is the Janus phase of the temporary protection system, I think. And this is very important to keep in mind, because there is so much controversies and the discourses around that, and it has a very big potential to polarize the different groups of people, pitting different groups of people to each other. But Nina, I would like to hear in terms of, if you would like to say anything about that, the differences and with the 2015 and then now, in terms of the challenges that the displacement, the influx of the massive displaced people posed to the city, but also to the NGOs.
I think there are a lot of differences, but also a lot of similarities. And it's really sad to say, but when it all started, we felt like, again. So we are standing here again, having to discuss those topics. We've been there, we've done that. We know how it works, and it felt like a lot of NGOs, they learned the lessons. They did all the reflections and learned the lessons and knew what it took in this situation. Tried it before, failed before, improved it. So we learned what it takes. It was the same for Train of Hope. We started from scratch in 2015, and in 2022 there were a lot of learnings we already had, where we knew we're not going to try it this way because we learned before it doesn't work. We're going to try it that way now because that apparently works out better. But in the overall management of this crisis, either on city level or also on the level of the federal government, you didn't really feel that they did their homework after 2015. There was a lot of things that we addressed to the public entities, and where we got the reaction that was like, oh, we didn't think about that. We're like, how can you not think about it? It's the same that we did 7 years ago. So for us, the biggest challenge was that you started over and over again from scratch, discussing things that you didn't need to discuss if everybody had done the homework, because there is a lot of knowledge. Also, if you talk to the NGOs, there's a lot of knowledge that you can build onto. There are a lot of experienced people that did it 7 years ago that you just need to put in the right places. There are a lot of resources that you can use, also volunteer resources, if you just know how to use those resources, where to place the right people to come up with the system. But this also takes the recognition of the public bodies that you have to let go a bit. Maybe you are not the most knowledgeable entity when it comes to a certain aspect of crisis management. Maybe you sit down and listen to all those that have been involved in this before and come up with an overall strategy that you put up together with all the knowledge that is here in the field, and not decide sitting on a desk what might be right while the people working with the target group in the field tell you won't work out.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, I think it is important also to underline the similarities, that we always talk about the differences, and I mean, and then it is putting the people into very different categories, is that, and the similarities I think was important, and what is learned and what not. And I mean, we would definitely like to take questions from the audience, but I will give the floor to Tanja, Maier, and Nataliia Kolchanova, sorry for my pronunciation. But what, I mean, in terms of the direct dilemmas that you were referring to, direct dilemmas, the contradictions that you were talking about only in terms of the Grundversorgung, kind of those tensions, but as someone who had experienced the whole system that you went with the nostrification, you went for this kinds of the problems. As someone who had experience, I would like to also ask the others too, what do we take as from this experience for kind of preparedness as an individual, as an NGO, and for suggestions for future kinds of displacements, for just reflecting on that. What do you take from that? What was the most important kind of the bottleneck for you?
For me was very important support, yes. Financial support, but you know, without support family and friends, it's impossible to live in Vienna. Yes, it's true, and it's it's my answer. Yes.
Okay.
And you know, when I worked, I also need some additional financial, yes, because it's also very difficult to organize my life. Take only my salary, use only my salary. And I understand that financial question is difficult, and I really appreciate you and Vienna for such support. But in reality, yes, it's maybe not enough for real life. It's true, but really I feel appreciate. Yes, and all my friends also feel appreciate to your city and Austria. It's important to us your help.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, maybe also if we talk about work. For us, very important some time for find work. We use English, for example, language, because German language we need some time. We need some time for study German. Yes, and if we want to work, we need speak German. Yes, and it's also like key for its possibility to people to earn money. Yes, themselves. Yes, because you know, only financial support from city is not enough. People need also to do something. They need also earn money. And maybe my idea is, for example, if I start to work, yes, maybe I also need some small support. For example, for rent, yes, because now I need rent a flat and the price very high, even for a small flat, yes. And I suppose it also will be good motivation for people to work, yes, because only if people get only support from town, it's not only for them good motivation, be passive, yes, it's also. Mm-hmm.
Okay, maybe then, Tanja, Maier, that I could ask that also in the findings that came, that the strong reliance on civil society, that and then the volunteers and then the volunteers initiatives, and then there was a kind of a hint that, of course, Austria is not. I mean, there is no. Here, our point is not that to say that, oh, Austria didn't do this and the city of Vienna didn't do this, but this has been a trend also in many different parts of the world and in very different areas. But what could you see as a major problem of that kind of too much reliance, or maybe that was coming up from the findings, that kind of a strong reliance on civil society and so strong reliance to voluntary organizations for the governance and the management and provision of care for the displaced. At one point, grassroots movements, grassroots initiatives are very important. On the other hand, whether you see a kind of a dark side of that kind of, I'm putting dark side in quotation marks, like that kind of a reliance on civil society. So I would like to hear from kind of the volunteer work that you were so much engaged, that from you.
That's an interesting question. I mean, at the beginning, sort of in the spring of last year, I met an incredible number of amazing volunteers, and we all were from different backgrounds. We didn't know each other's nationalities. We just had one thing in common, that we could speak Ukrainian or Russian. And we all worked together. We still work together. We are still all in touch with each other. And we were filling the gaps, but I naively thought when we started that was going to be just for a short period of time. And you probably knew that wasn't going to be the case, but I didn't know. And so what makes me frustrated is the Ukrainian people are so resilient and so smart and clever to figure things out, even when they only have 20 euros left in their pocket, that if money had just been put in their hands instead of into the hands of NGOs, state actors, if they'd just been given directly the means to make their own decisions, I just think everything could have been so much smoother. I mean, I was dealing with situations that I have zero training for this year. You know, I had a deaf man in a wheelchair texting me from his dorm room where there was an NGO on duty and refusing to call the ambulance, and I had to call the ambulance twice. And he left Austria, and he texts me every once in a while from Romania, where he's now in a refugee center there because he just gave up. And so if we could have had a little bit more flexibility, because this is, I don't know that much about the previous crisis, but this one seems fundamentally different, because when Ukraine wins, and I really believe that Ukraine will eventually win, most of the people are going to go home. They haven't come forever. They just want to be here now to keep their kids safe, because their moms can't look their kids in the face and say, I didn't do what I could to keep you safe for this period of time. That's why they're here. So if we could have just lifted a little bit of the bureaucracy, had a few more flexible solutions. For example, school. Yeah, we have school places, but they're forcing them to sit in classrooms where they're not learning much. I just wrote last week, after speaking with a number of mothers, here in Vienna, it's a huge problem, because you have a huge number of kids in Vienna who don't speak German at home. So the school system created this thing called an integration class, where they're supposed to be learning German. In reality, they're not learning much of anything, and then they're missing out on the Ukrainian online school. And the mother said, can we please just do Ukrainian online school? We want to go back to Ukraine. We want our kids to study university in Ukraine. No, it's Schulpflicht, and you have to go to school here. And the kids are exhausted trying to do two things. After they had 2 years of COVID, then a war, then changing country, and they haven't seen their father for 9 months. It's not easy. So I think that we as volunteers, we're just like tiny drops in the bucket, but we can't fix what needed to be systemic changes. And the noises, I've learned this new word this year in German, which is called Einzelfälle. And this is what it means is a single case. And so I think a lot of what the state actors spend their time doing is calling around trying to fix this one single case where this one person didn't get paid that for blah, blah. But that's a sign, it reminds me sort of like late stage communism. Like, it's a sign that things aren't working and that maybe there could have been an easier way. So, and I don't know what the right word is to use for it, but of course there's a certain amount of burnout. I mean, we can't raise funds like we could in April. People cannot. I have the luxury of being able to volunteer my time at huge cost to my personal and family life, yeah, but not everybody can do that. Yeah. And it's hard when it's not it is perhaps too much to ask of us, and those of us that are in the middle of it, it's like really hard to set boundaries and say, okay, I can't,
I mean, I think that the burnout issue came up with in the research also, but also you were referring to a kind of the not only people trying to make sense of coping strategies using kind of patchwork, but the institutions are also kind of, there is a kind of an institutional patchwork which with the Einzelfälle that you were trying to refer to, but they all also connect to that it is not systemic, that is. On the other hand, I think it's always good to know and about the different groups and different times in the city. People, different groups went through very similar kind of, were confronted with very similar kind of questions, issues in terms of nostrification, in terms of the schooling, and in terms of the language problems. But also what I find it important is that there was in the panel that we should not overburden solidarity. And it is important that the solidarity networks, but also maybe it is also important to provide the kind of the provisions in such a way that will hinder solidarity networks between different groups too, because the discourses about temporary protection system here a little bit less, but everyone thinks that you have access next day to the labor market and everything is good, you could work, and it doesn't work, and then I know the case also for the Syrians under temporary protection system in Turkey. There is a kind of, this is the basis of a kind of a very populist sentiments against that pitting the kind of the different groups of people to each other. But thank you very much for very different facets of the kind of the bottlenecks. But we would like to take some questions from the audience too. Please, maybe she was at the very, she was first, I think. The mic is not working.
Is it working now?
Yeah, it is.
Hello, my name is Elena. I'm a fellow here and I'm also vertriebene aus Ukraine. So first of all, I would like to thank you, Ayşe, and your team for the research that you're doing and for raising these questions, because there are indeed many struggles that Ukrainian refugees run into, but it is not so easy for us to raise those issues, because we must be grateful because, as you mentioned, our status is so fundamentally vulnerable and precarious. And you mentioned in your discussion the local level and the federal level of dealing with all of it, but there's also international level. And when I was looking at the lines at the border, children playing on the ground at Hauptbahnhof and all the other train stations across Central Eastern European countries, I was wondering, where is the UNHCR? Where are all the other multiple UN bodies that are responsible for it, multiple bodies, connected with the Red Cross and so on? So is this just my kind of distorted perception, or have you come into contact with any support systems organized by these massive humanitarian organizations? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we just collect a couple of questions because of time, and then we pass it to that whoever would like to take up.
Thank you so much, and I would like to thank you as well for this research that the team has done. It's very important. My name is Arina Jena, and I'm also a volunteer, and I'm gonna represent here people who on February 24th in 9 a.m. Ukrainian students who organized kind of like crisis headquarters in Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church of St. Barbara in Post-Gaza East. Probably you've all heard about it. And I want to thank very much Tanja for what she has done and for training home actually. And it's very, very bad that...
you switched it off maybe. Oh, the battery. Okay. Okay. I thought that this only happens to me. I'm always happy to see the others. That.
Yeah, and it's very bad that City of Vienna is not here, because I'd like to know everyone that Ukrainian students who actually we did not fill the gaps for Stadt Wien and the City of Vienna for the first 2 months. We actually did the job for City of Vienna in the first 2 months, because like in a week after the full-scale invasion, we organized a hotline which contained like 10 phones, and people who arrived could arrive to Postgasse, and we would help them. As well, our number of this hotline, City of Vienna put on their website. So actually, I would like to say that I'm here of the voice of these students, of 70 people who gave up their university, their job, and a lot of their time to help people who arrived. And in my opinion, it's also very important to say thank you to these people who worked this much. I thank you so much, Train of Hope, because a lot of people could arrive to you as well, and they know that they would receive help. And thank you for all the volunteers who was on the main train station and the bus station. Thank you so much, Caritas. But yeah, it's very important to thank these students, because none of them received a penny from this job that they has been done. It was just because we all have families in Ukraine. My whole family is still in Kiev. My grandma, she's in Zaporizhia, and she's under the shillings every day. So I would like to, it's important to mention these people who in the first 2 months did a lot of stuff for people who arrived for Ukraine. And it was very good point about that city did not made a homework, and a lot of people did not made a homework from this. And yeah, a tip, so make a homework from this, because if because next crisis could come, and definitely if we're not stop Russia right now, the next crisis could be from people from Latvia, Lithuania, or Poland. So in my opinion, it's important, and it's also should be a very high and important aim for the whole Europe, for our own security, to stop Russia there. So it wouldn't be next crisis.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
And then we take the third question, and then yes. Yeah, I mean, I lost track of who was the first.
Hello, my name is Müge Dalkıran, and I was a former fellow here last year, and now I'm at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. Thank you for all the insights, and my question is concerning the different minority groups and the people who were already in international protection or similar protection in Ukraine before they came here. Because in Germany, in November, I was there for a project, and in Cologne, that was one of the topics highlighted over and over, that there were further categorizations for those people, and it was even more difficult and challenging for them to access to labor market, first of all, and secondly, there were more travel restrictions within the country in comparison with the Ukrainian nationals. So I'm wondering if there are similar challenges here in Austria or in Vienna, and how does it work for them? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's an important point that we were not touching upon, but I will just give the floor. Do you want to, is there anyone who would like to pick up the question with this international bodies in terms of, yes, please.
We have somebody from the UNHCR in the audience, so maybe Birgit wants to.
Yes.
I could see her waving.
Okay.
Hello. My name is Birgit Einzenberger. I'm heading the protection unit of UNHCR here in Austria. So as you may know, our headquarters is based in Geneva. We are present worldwide almost in about 120 countries. But the way that we work differs very much from the capacities and infrastructures of the countries where we work. So when you look, for example, at Kenya, where we are, have a major role in running refugee camps. in other countries where we basically do the asylum procedure. In Europe and especially in the EU, the situation is very much different. Austria is an experienced asylum country with, with an asylum system since more than 70 years of experience in implementing the Geneva Refugee Convention. So we're a small office. We have 10 persons or 10 positions in our office. We mainly work on advocacy and monitoring. So we try to monitor the situation of refugees and asylum seekers in Austria, try to identify where we have major gaps, and then seek to find solutions to this in cooperation with the authorities, with civil society, etc. So I've been in contact with all the members on the panel, with Tanja only briefly, but I follow your Twitter account. We visited repeatedly a Train of Hope. We, for example, very quickly also went to the Austrian border, to Nickelsdorf, for example, to see how does it work when Ukrainian cars arrive, and it was really amazing to see that in the early days, almost every second car had an Ukrainian number plate. The police helped us to pull the cars on the side, and we could ask the refugees where they were heading to, what their plans are, if they needed information. We have a small website, it's called help.unhcr.org, which we have almost worldwide, where we provide basic information for refugees. So we also made sure in all European countries that Ukrainian refugees have, the first information on our website. And UNHCR has, in the countries neighboring Ukraine, been at the border from the first hour. So we started the emergency preparedness way before the war broke out, what we would do in the event that there would be massive displacement. And so my colleagues have been on the main border points as from the first hours. For example, a question that you alluded to, negotiating access to safety for everyone wanting to flee Ukraine. So our mandate are refugees and stateless persons. So our mandate is not to protect, migrants, but of course, when migrants, for example, students or migrant workers lived in Ukraine and fled the war, it is essential that they could also seek safety in the neighboring countries in order to then, look at their future and maybe prepare a return to their countries of origin or try to get a student visa or something else for another country. And so we try to also map and see the response to the Ukrainians all over Austria. So we visited all provinces, have been in touch with NGOs and officials throughout the country. And we also especially also look into the legal legislation. So we have advocated with the government how the response should be implemented. We have from very early on also said that maybe the basic care system, the Grundversorgung, was good, was a useful, quick response, because this was a system that existed, that can more quickly prepare more capacity, because we know that for social aid also process takes a long time to make an application. It's very cumbersome. And how would you find an apartment when you only receive social aid? So, but we now in November actually came up with the recommendations where, including Ukrainian refugees into social aid was one main recommendation. And we have seen in our mapping of the response in the EU that more than half of the EU member states give refugees from Ukraine full access to social aid as for their citizens. And maybe a last word, the Ukrainian refugee situation has really put the spotlight on the major deficiencies in the Austrian reception system. So it shows that the reception standards in the Grundversorgung, there are no minimum standards. So people can be very lucky and be accommodated in a very, very nice, reception center run by Caritas or Volkshilfe or Integrationshaus or whatever, where they get very professional, support, where they are, met with a very friendly, in a very friendly climate, where they get the necessary, interpretation support that they need. But then they may also end up in a, pension, in a bed and breakfast somewhere in a village where someone just wants to, make a living out of hosting them, or even just, make money out of people. And then another word that I've missed a bit so far in the discussion is how you receive persons with special needs. And I think this is a major difference 2015-16, when yes, there were handicapped persons there and children, but not as many as now. So we know from other countries that up to 20% or up to 25% of Ukrainian refugees have special needs, you know, chronically ill persons, handicapped persons, separate or unaccompanied children. And in Austria, also in the basic care system, there is no clear identification of special needs, no adequate response, and also Ukrainians don't get the nursing allowance, the Pflegegeld. So this is a major problem, especially also for cases that you, Tanja, portray, where these people really find themselves often in a very desperate situation or are stuck for long periods in, you know, first arrival centers, because not even wheelchair, you know, accessible places are very rare.
We had it in the project also for the disabilities and how that was carried or not. But I mean, I think it is very important to, with the international, the names, the categories also anchor you to very different legislations and then the different institutions. And you're not under international protection once you are under temporary protection status. You're not a refugee. That you're not following. It is in the daily language used as the refugee, but it is not. So it puts you into a very different kinds of rights regimes, and so I think this was very important, that the question that you were raising. Is there anyone who would like to pick up the third country nationals issue in Austria or other places?
I only have a short and sort of Kafkaesque answer. So yes, and it's complicated, and it's full of Einzelfälle as well. So our legal counselling service has been sort of dealing with all of these, especially students were like third country students, a lot of Indian students. That was one sort of group that got some media attention in the beginning, but there's a whole host of other students, migrants, those receiving protection, those receiving some sort of temporary protection, those within status determination within Ukraine. So it's a whole quagmire of sort of trying to get two bureaucracies sort of to fit in together. On the positive side, most of these cases that I'm aware of have been able to be resolved in a positive way, but it took a lot of manpower and it took a lot of time and it took a lot of, you know, writing and filling out forms and whatnot. But it's not a sort of stuck situation where there's, you know, a dead end, a bureaucratic dead end. It's just, it's complicated, it takes time, and basically somebody with a legal training has to look at it.
Okay, I would give the floor to Olga or Ruslana, but I mean, of course, the third country national students is a choice issue, and then unfortunately my university didn't choose that way.
I mean,
excluded
but
them.
It's not only students, but as far as I remember the law, actually, the Austria did not extend the right for temporary protection explicitly to third country nationals with residence permit, only to those who have recognized refugee status in Ukraine. And actually, among our informants, there is a person who is a double refugee. She fled Belarus. She was in the process of applying for residence permit. She came here. She lodged her application. She was allowed to lodge her application with Caritas. She waited for 3 months. Her documents were accepted. Her traumatized son was accepted to the school. And then she was refused, because, of course, it's not in the letter, and she is deported now. So she was deported back to Poland, thankfully not to Belarus. I mean, and at the same time, I know some cases that when things worked on somehow on individual basis, but as far as at least the members of the letter of the law, that Germany explicitly acknowledged all who had an official residence status in Ukraine. So not only under international protections people, but people with residence in Ukraine. They were eligible to temporary protection. In Austria, there was no this explicit recognition.
Hence, again, with the Einzelfälle, and somebody has to look at it, and somebody has to force it through.
And also, as I said, in the universities, it was their capacity. It was in their capacity to accept them or not. And I am also a professor at the University of Vienna, and from the first day on, that was there that the third country nationals, whether they had residency or not in Ukraine, and then the universities, they were excluded from every scheme at the university, having access to education and to certain kinds of rights, which was not the case in Germany. So these are very much kind of national legislations. But
I just wanted to add in relation to acceptance of people who received refugee status in Ukraine, because for them, those who did receive that status, it would be easier because they are also recognized as people for whom European countries provide protection. But another issue is that in Ukraine, it's not easy to receive refugee status. Sometimes it's even almost impossible. Like, for example, people from Belarus, they sometimes just cannot receive the refugee status there, and as a result, they are not recognized as people who require protection in the EU countries, and this is a completely blind spot in this whole system.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ruslana. I think what I learned in life is that never stand between food, drinks, and the people in between. We have a reception afterwards, downstairs, wine and cheese, but still there was a question that we would like to take the last question. I think she was there first.
Thank you so much for taking my question. My name is Saskia. I'm working with IOM Austria, and I'm very much interested in the topic of housing, of accommodation, because we're doing some data collection at the moment on that topic. But what I would like to understand better, maybe from you, David, is because you said that Caritas was handling Grundversorgung for those in private accommodation, and we've heard that the majority actually is living in private accommodation. So I was wondering, in how far are you able to, not only to pay the rent subsidies, but also, to provide information, maybe counseling for those who are displaced, but also for those who are hosting displaced people from Ukraine. And furthermore, are you also able to maybe follow up on the housing standards and the quality?
Okay, but this is
raising a harsh last point there. You're touching a very vulnerable point there, because you don't have to be a social worker of any sort to know that with the housing benefit that Ukrainians or anybody else who receives Grundversorgung in private accommodation can't find a reasonable flat in the city of Vienna. Anybody who's looked for a flat here knows this. This is not rocket science. What we've seen again and again and again, not just with Ukrainians, and especially with asylum seekers from Afghanistan, from Syria, from wherever, is on the one hand an incredible resilience of sort of making it work somehow, which on the face of it is, crazy in all sorts of ways, but also a vulnerability to exploitation, just because if the funds that you're receiving aren't enough to make ends meet, you have to make ends meet in any other shape or form. So no real answer to your question. It's a huge problem. It's a massive problem, especially because so many Ukrainians now are living in sort of what you could call sort of, sort of temporary accommodation of sorts. So somebody took people in and thought, this is only going to last a couple of weeks, a couple of months, and months turn into half a year, and not in Vienna, but in Lower Austria, we were working and still are with the government of Lower Austria, which is a whole other topic, but in this case, they had indeed, but they set up a counseling service for people who were hosting Ukrainian refugees. And so there we've run a telephone hotline and a counseling service, and it's basically the same story, not to sound disrespectful, but it's the same story over and over again, with sort of people running out of patience, money, space, energy bills, and the like. So I think we're far away from a discussion of sort of housing standards at this point, where we're depending, and you raised this point, we're depending on the charity of others. And I mean, this is a very Caritas point to make, but but something that is due in justice should not be given as a charitable gift is sort of one of the basic tenets of this organization here. And I think what we've seen is there's an incredible energy and there's incredible resources in volunteers that are sort of picking up a lot of things, and all of them are like you were asking, all right, what's next? What's that point where I can sort of, you know, where's the other housing situation? So, and this is a sad economic point, and then I'll shut up. But one of the problems, even for NGOs, is that providing organized accommodation, which is the other possibility, so 90% of Ukrainians in private accommodation, but 10% in organized accommodation. And as you rightly pointed out, that's a bit of a lottery. You could be in very nice accommodation or somewhat less nice. But if you're providing accommodation that you can actually write your name on, then whatever subsidies you receive from the government will not cover basic costs, especially with rising energy and whatnot. So there's even less of an incentive to offer organized accommodation as a way out of temporary accommodation that's no longer sustainable after almost a year, where people are just saying, like, I need this space back, which is also like, understandable in a way, and puts volunteers in a very, very dicey and very, very difficult situation.
Sorry. Okay, sorry to end with a very, a very. Okay.
I want to say thank you for everybody. Nevertheless, Vienna, Austria did a lot of things to us. I'm Ukrainian refugee or replaced person. No, I am. Okay. To spell I am Ukrainian refugee without crying, without all this stuff. And as for my result or my experience, when you are at a loss or when you in absolute despair and when you are zero, just try to help others. It's the best way to escape all this depression and so on and so on. Let's help and do it. And I'm eager to thank you. Me.
That's a positive note to end on.
This was not staged. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. But please again join me to thanking all our panel participants, but also our researchers, and I think you have addressed very important points, and I think that our research is also very good. That it initiated this kind of a conversation. Thank you. Thank you. So please join us downstairs for wine and cheese so that we could continue our conversations there. Thank you very much.